Good morning, everybody. Today's date is Thursday, February 27th. I'm Tom Kaczynski. Welcome to Coronavirus Central, your one-stop shop for everything you want to know about coronavirus and probably a lot of things you don't. I just want to say welcome to all of our new listeners. We're so grateful that you decided to join in with us. We actually had 11,000 distinctive downloads yesterday. So we really are becoming an active open source intelligence network. And the results of that will hopefully become very clear in this show, where a lot of the information was actually provided from listeners on YouTube, on the podcast, through iTunes, and the various platforms on which this is out there. So allow me to say thank you and to invite you to join our team at t.me/coronavirus central. All episodes are posted at coronaviruscentral.net, and you can find the links to the YouTube site there. Please subscribe there, subscribe on iTunes, leave a nice review, and, just do what you got to do to get the show out there. So I want to say thank you for all that, and today we're going to go into a lot of detail about a couple cases and how this is spreading. We're going to talk about President Trump's comments. We're going to talk about some other articles out there, the explosion happening in South Korea, and maybe an idea of why certain treatments are working. This is going to be more speculative at the end of that, but I think, obviously we're interested in a cure, and we are not interested in waiting if we can get there faster. And the one thing this show has done, which I think a lot of people find helpful, is we look at a lot of information, we touch on many things, but we're looking for trend lines, we're looking to put the pieces together. I'm not a biologist, I'm a historian and a trend forecaster, but what I look for is how to connect the dots in sequence, and a lot of times we have a lot of information out about what's happening with the COVID-19 outbreak, but we don't necessarily have a coherent narrative. And so my hope is that this podcast, through the efforts to put a narrative to that, can help guide people. And I want to say I'm especially grateful for the doctors, physicians, researchers, professional journalists, and all the people who are using this podcast to help guide their efforts. We just want you to succeed. So whatever you can do, if we can help, join in with us, and let's pool our efforts. So we're going to jump in. There's a lot of information today. I'm going to try to condense the show if I can just a little bit. I really do try to keep to an hour. I often fail because there's just so much to share, especially on a day like this. There's just too much happening. So we start every podcast with the numbers that are out there, and we're going to go to covid19info.live, which we've been using from the beginning. And we have from here the overall number that is being reported is 82,487 confirmed cases, 2,808 deaths, and that is as of 6:20 a.m. on February 27th on the United States East Coast. So, confirmed number of deaths, 78,497 out of China. Confirmed cases, with 2,744 deaths. We do have some research that's out there from the Epoch Times that was reported from the Shandong province, showing that they were reporting different numbers at the local level versus the national level, and that the local levels were significantly higher. So I would recommend, if you want to look into this, we're not going to do it today, but it's worth watching the Peak Prosperity broadcast that Dr. Chris Martenson does every day. He does a very good analysis of that. I'll put a link into the links for that so you have an opportunity to see that episode. And it's really important because as we go through this, one of the things that we're going to talk about a lot at the beginning is just how much we're relying on early Chinese reports for how we are shaping our expectations for what COVID-19 will and won't do. And those expectations, hopefully, I don't know if I say hopefully, they hopefully we have data that's useful in analyzing this, but it could be far better or far worse depending upon the accuracy of that data. And what we've also observed, and Dr. Martenson reports on this, is that the provinces where they are undercutting the amount of people who are sick are those provinces where they most heavily in China want to restart their economic engine. Research out there says that they're right now having half or more of the people are not at work, that productive capacity in some places is down to under a third, and that they are starting to have major supply chain problems, which is something we worry about worldwide. And obviously we want China to be able to get back to work and people to do so, but there is this tension where if you send them back during the time where there is a highly infectious disease, you may end up exacerbating this sickness. And that's something we're concerned about, not just for China, but it's going to be a problem every country is going to face, which we talked about at some depth yesterday. So what I wanted to do, we'll continue through the countries. South Korea has jumped to 1,766 cases, 13 deaths reported. A big part of what's driving the South Korea number jump is that they are doing incredibly active testing. I would give you today's update, which is actually accurate for yesterday. The CDC has tested 445 cases. South Korea has tested 35,000. And obviously there are problems with the test. Those are understood. We're going to talk about that more later. Nonetheless, you find what you're looking for, and the CDC, at least to public knowledge, doesn't seem to be looking for much. Diamond Princess, that's the cruise ship, up to 705. Italy continues to expand, 470 cases, 12 deaths. We also have seen cases from Italy spread to countries like Germany, now up to 27, Spain up to 13. I saw that Austria had a few new cases. It's listing as 2 here. People are going to UK, 15. So we are seeing these cluster vectors, and a lot of what we're going to talk about on the show today is how that happens, and we'll put some articles in front of you, and we're going to look at what an American cluster might look like before it happens. And hopefully I'm wrong, but I'll make the case, you make the decision. Iran reporting 245 cases, 26 deaths. There's a study out today, and we're going to talk about it much more tomorrow. I'm trying to put Iran pieces together that says as many as 18,000 may be infected. We have members of their own government reporting the death toll is far beyond 26. Once again, there's a information opacity issue there. Japan at 189, Singapore 93, Hong Kong 62. The United States is now up to 60. Kuwait 43, Thailand 40. Interesting thing happening out there. A lot of countries are banning travel from Thailand. Why is that? Thailand never closed their air or land borders with China, nor with Wuhan. So apparently a lot of the Wuhan refugees, this is anecdotal, but a number of them went to Thailand and then went and transited from Thailand to a third country. Remember, as we've reported and as was widely reported on January 22nd, the night before the Wuhan quarantine went down, there were up to 5 million people who had reportedly left Wuhan and left for other places. A lot of those people scattered throughout China. A number of them left. It's reasonable that some of them actually went out through Thailand to points in the United States, North America, Europe, and that was something that was expected. Okay, so Bahrain 33, Taiwan 32, the Emirates 13, and I'm just saying with the Middle East cluster, Saudi Arabia announced yesterday through their ministry they were shutting their borders to religious immigrants coming into the country. That's a pretty big deal for Saudi Arabia. That's pretty much how they make their money beyond oil, and let's keep in mind, oil has been dropping. It's down to about $48 a barrel as of yesterday's price, and I only mention this because when oil goes under $40 a barrel, a lot of economists will tell you what happens is that major industries caught up in energy start losing a lot of money, and that reflects decreased global demand based upon the fact that the supply is not there and is not moving. The Dow Jones and the continuing fall, despite all efforts to prop it up, is caught up in these fundamentals. And one correction I want to issue, that I had been talking about the article from Market Watch yesterday about the bond markets and that the bond yield was going down. I misidentified as panic, which I think could be true in one sense, but that really an investor had told me, and he made a lot of sense, that what's happening there is people are looking for security in the United States government, which also speaks to the supply chain issues and fits perfectly in the narrative. But I want to thank that person for the correction, as well as the person who told me I should be calling it Veneto instead of Veneto, it's Venezia, so it'd be Veneto. We're always trying to get it right, and there's a lot to read, a lot to process, certainly, and we're going to get a lot of things wrong with this. I'll just put that up front. I'm making jumps so we can actually be prepared for things, and hoping I get a lot more right than wrong. So far, we've been doing pretty good. We'll keep at it. You guys keep our feet to the fire, and we'll try to put the best information out there. There's no vanity in this. Chock full of cases in the 20s. Australia's up to 23, Malaysia 22, like I said, France 18. And we'll see how those things come in. We'll take a closer look at the Eurozone next week or Saturday, depending on how fast it breaks. I'm expecting you're going to have big spreads happening there, and it may shut down trade in the Schengen zone, which is where the free border zone of Europe. So those are the cases that are out there today. And we're going to start today with an article that was featured in The Sun from the UK, thesun.co.uk. And this is an exclusive that has been updated as of noon, I assume that's Greenwich Standard Time, 26th of February. Virus fears. Deadly coronavirus could infect 80% of Brits and kill 500,000 in worst-case scenario, document reveals. And this was by Stephen Moyes and Nick McDermott. Now, before I get into the article, I would say that the virologists and the researchers who've been looking at this for a while and the modelers of infection, this is not news to us. But it's interesting because the strategy which we had seen previously of the media not telling you anything about this virus other than to say, hey, go wash your hands and, don't get the flu, is beginning to crumble. And whether that's being allowed, gag orders are going out, investigative journalists are asking questions, I don't know. These people are still 2 weeks behind us, but I'm using this as for two examples. Number one, that the public is now being given more information, which I think reflects an understanding from those in power that people need to be preparing for something worse. We saw an example, Canada, Austria, the UK, and even the CDC in the US are now telling people this pandemic may come here, is likely to come here, could come here, begin preparing. And they would not be saying that if they did not think that it was absolutely necessary for you to begin preparing. So when they say may, in that instance, I think you need to interpret it as must. So the article, 4 in 5 Brits could become infected by deadly coronavirus, with up to 500,000 killed, according to a doomsday scenario set out in official papers seen by The Sun. Ministers are now considering the assumption that more than 50 million people in the UK could catch the killer bug. A memo seen by The Sun last night states that the reasonable worst case, and I don't like that word reasonable, but we'll leave that alone for the moment, involves up to 80% of the population being infected. The document by the National Security Communications Team warns the current assumption is that 2 to 3% of symptomatic cases will result in fatality. Around 500,000 Brits, mostly the elderly or those with pre-existing illnesses, would be killed under this scenario. The figures are in a sensitive government report called COVID-19 Reasonable Worst Case Scenario. It predicts infection rates will snowball for 2 to 3 months once the bug begins spreading. And I think I just want to parse these words apart for one moment. Reasonable worst case scenario. To me, reasonable, the only thing it could mean there is that we could handle. Because in an unreasonable worst case scenario, the government cannot handle this. And there's a lot of unreasonable things because viruses aren't known for their sympathy for the human condition, beyond what we can provide for them. A government said every eventuality had to be planned for, but this does not mean we expect it to happen. Experts estimate a major outbreak may see more than 2 million people in hospital, crippling the NHS. One hospital's isolation pod was revealed yesterday as a small tent behind some bins with one chair and a phone to call the emergency. Okay. So I don't want to read all this because there's a lot in it, but it's talking about the response for the NHS. And I want to talk about the numbers for a second because that's really interesting to me. And I'm going to use their own assumptions. So the United Kingdom has 66 million people, and that's where they're getting that 50 million number from. 80% is roughly 50 million people. And so they say the current planning is that 2 to 3% of symptomatic cases will result in a fatality. So let's use their own numbers. We'll just use 2% to make the math easier. If 2%, now we know from other research, and I'm going to draw upon the reports from Imperial College in the UK, reporting from the Lancet, reporting from the Journal of American Medicine, that all seem to agree on a number that's roughly 80% of people are mild or asymptomatic, and 20% of people are serious, with a quarter of those being very critical, okay? So if we're talking about 20% of 50 million people, that's going to be 10 million people. And if you're talking about 2% of 10 million people, let's do the math real fast here, 10% times 0.02, 1 sec. The number you're looking at would be around 200,000 that would theoretically die at a 2% case fatality rate of the ones who are really critical, right? But they must be taking the number out of the whole, that 2% rate assumes that of the 50 million that you're going to have 500,000 die. The problem is you're going to have this run on the hospital, and they actually report this in the article. They were saying that they anticipate in this situation that up to 2 million people would use the hospital system. If their own assumptions are right, you're actually going to deal with a situation where you're more likely going to see about 10 million people, based upon the previous evidence, need to have access to the hospital, probably in very short order with one another. And this is where the math gets a little fuzzy. If you have 10 million people all trying to use the NHS, or in the case of the United States, our hospitals, you're going to see an overrun, in which case then that death rate is going to spike well above the 2% that they're projecting. What we saw in Hubei province was 18%. And so let's use that number here just for an example. Then you're looking at a death rate that's going to look much more like 2 million people, assuming that those are the only those sick people are getting this. So what they're doing is they're underestimating this by a significant margin. And we show that this here, just by doing simple math, is maybe a quarter of what a reasonable scenario is. And there are more difficult scenarios that are out there we could look at. And the basic math isn't that hard. You take the number of people, you multiply it times the amount you think is going to get infected, which I would say is probably in the West closer to 90%, because the number they're using to project the amount of people who will get infected assumes wide quarantines that I don't think are going to happen in the West. And I don't think people, especially in Europe more than the U.S., people are not geographically dispersed enough to really see a large number of people excluded from that. So that's your first assumption. Your second assumption is the number of people who are severely impaired who are going to be able to get sick. And this is a problem for Europe and the United States, where we're using a 20% number, but let's keep in mind we're using that from China, where the population skews younger. In Western countries where people live longer for various reasons, we have more older people. And as all the medical research has reported, people over 60 are much more at risk. In the United States, you're talking about 75 million people, which is about a quarter of the population as instead of 20%, and the much smaller percentage it made up of the Chinese population by comparison. So if you assume those sorts of things, you might see that number jump up as well. And then we're looking at a death toll at about 2 to 3 million potentially, assuming that everything else holds together, that they don't run out of antibiotics and all these things. And the reason I'm going into this is just to say that I think the media is warming people up to the idea this is far worse than they've been prepared for. This Sun article, the Tucker Carlson show, all of these things are first efforts by a coordinated government media campaign to let people know whatever they're saying publicly. They want to float trial balloons about how bad this is and see how people respond to it, rather than saying, okay, well, we're going to deal with something where we're going to face a 5 to 25% death rate, a lack of supplies, food shortages, and quarantines for 30 to 60 days. If they went out there and said that, and that's a very realistic assessment of what could happen, people would panic. That's probably why my show's growing, because I'm out here telling you these things, and I'm just doing the math. Some people have accused me of being a fearmonger, but I am just laying down the assumptions of everything that I'm doing. And I want to share one thing. One of the biggest assumptions I have, because I've had some people say, well, how are you getting to these figures? How are you getting to these projections? And what this relies on, I'm going to build the case backwards for those who haven't been listening. This is from episode 12. This was a report from Imperial College, and I'll relink it in today's show. And it said they had case fatality ratio estimates for 3 strata of COVID. Cases detected in Hubei, the case fatality rate was 18%, with an interval between 11 to 81%. That's a huge number, and that number of uncertainty reflects the uncertainty about the accuracy of what China was reporting for the sickness rate. Number 2, they estimate for those in travelers outside mainland China, 1.2 to 5.6%. And for people who are in who are actually in places, they estimate that it's around 1%. So I use that and all of those numbers so that you understand how these were collated. Those of us who have been watching this, professional and amateur alike, since about January have been tracing the case studies of the reports that started mainly in Hubei province, but now have spread slightly wider in China. And there is a slight contradiction at the heart of this that we have accepted that needs to be shared with you because you need to know what the presumptions are. And we always need to recheck these. The presumption that I have been working from, and I think all of us have accepted, is that papers published in journals from medical researchers from China have greater validity. We believe that what's being reported in terms of case studies on the ground is accurate, it is valid. Now, these are doctors who are credentialed from universities that have been used for many years in the past, but we also know that the Communist Party in the throes of this pandemic there could potentially be altering this information. And we, from the beginning, have kind of looked at this where we're saying we don't trust the case numbers, we do trust the case studies, because the logic of it is that the case studies, you want to have the information out there so that this can get cured, which is in the interest of all parties, and that there is a higher trust and faith that doctors reporting a clinical scientific report are providing accurate evidence as opposed to politicians and bureaucrats who are making a statement about the number of cases. If that is wrong, if Wuhan is atypical, if this is worse in other places, which it might be in Iran, if this is better in other places, maybe Japan isn't doing as badly for some reason, then these presumptions need to be altered. And frankly, we don't know. I got to put that out there. We can make reasonable estimates based on what's out there. It's a big case number. There's two that we reported on yesterday of 50,000 and 70,000 cases observed, which seem to fit the general thrust of evidence. But those are assumptions, and I want you to know that because we don't really know what we're dealing with exactly. We're just acting quickly, and we're trying to fit the things to the numbers. But like I said, with assumptions, we're asking this. One of the things you see on all these websites and all these government releases, even COVID19.info.live, they say there's 33,132 recovered cases, okay? Which would be good news, except we have an article now to go along with the one in Taiwan Times. This one is today from the, what we got here? The Guardian. Coronavirus. Japanese woman tests positive for a second time. A tourist guide from Osaka had been given an all clear in early February, but then developed a sore throat and chest pains. So this woman who was in her 40s and a resident of Osaka in Western Japan tested positive on Wednesday after developing a sore throat and chest pains, the prefecture government said. She tested positive on January 29th, was discharged from the hospital after recovery on February 1st before testing negative on February 6th. And now we have a case where she was found that she tested positive yet again. They don't say the exact date in here, but I'm going to assume that it would have been yesterday because that would make sense, which would have been February 25th. So we have someone either that was still infected, reinfected, or that the testing was not accurate with. And I don't know, and we don't know. So we don't know what is in a cure. Are we getting over this? Are people who get COVID, are they getting over it? What's the long-term damages? The way they've been testing cured is that if a person is asymptomatic and tests negative on 2 test results and has a clear CT scan, that they are considered to be clear of this disease. And the problem with that is that we are looking at this from the function of saying, okay, the pneumonia is what COVID's about. And obviously that is something we have observed in many cases, and we know that is a key component to this that many people experience, and it is part of the severe nature of this disease. But we don't understand the full nature of this disease. What else is it doing? Are there long-term impacts? Does it remain contagious? And frankly, there's no studies about this. And this is a real problem. So we're going to start talking about this with respect to the question of contagiousness. This idea that you have a 14-day quarantine and you let people go, or you think that having these N95 masks that prevents droplets are preventing this, and we don't know. We learned from the Diamond Princess that there's strong evidence this is aerosolized. And that's why it's spread despite the measures that were taken, as faulty as they were, to protect quarantine. We've also learned now that we are dealing with a situation where we have multiple countries reporting people have gotten reinfected. And does that mean that people were infective for a lot longer after they were released? least, I mean, I don't know how long the viral load goes. Sometimes it can go quite a while, or maybe because we can't produce proper antibodies, we're getting this back. These are questions we don't know. And the problem is all the assumptions and policy planning that are out there assume basically you're sick with this, you get over this. And that is the case with a lot of diseases, but not all of them. And this is why we have to check our assumptions. And hopefully the medical researchers will start doing a lot more research. And I know it's a small case set, but at least so we have something to work on about what is happening afterwards and how long people are contagious. I think the quarantines need to be far longer until we have at least a 95, 98% confidence that the people we're letting out there are not sick. So I want to go into, we're going to two levels of case studies. The first one I want to go into is South Korea. There's a great site here. This is from Reuters Graphics, and it's called the Korean Clusters. How coronavirus cases exploded in South Korean churches and hospitals. This is from February 26, 2020. And it goes through, we would never get through this thing if I go through this whole article. I would just say it goes through all the sort of cases, and it demonstrates with a number of really helpful graphics how the spread happened so quickly. And one of the things that we have found is that the first case was found in January 20th in the country, which doesn't mean that's the first time it was there, but let's just use that number. That's about 35 days ago. So we've jumped from one case to, we are now reporting at this very instant 1,766 cases in the matter of 30 days. And remember, the jumps are exponential. So assuming South Korea, let's just say it's, what's the number I've seen out there, that it's doubling every 4 days. So you would expect to see South Korea, by the time I'm reporting to you on Monday, be up in the 3,000 to 4,000 range. And it's even a little worse than that, because a lot of what comes out of the Korean case is an example of how a single area can be a big problem. And this goes back to that Shincheonji church that we've talked about a little bit, where they were having meetings where they had as many as 9,000 people. In fact, I'll give it to you. The Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said on Saturday they had obtained a list of 9,300 people who had attended those two Shincheonji church services, around 1,200 of whom had complained of flu-like symptoms. Hundreds of cases have now been confirmed there. And I saw something yesterday where they were saying at that time they had tested 800 people, 700 of them had tested positive. And, some of them were asymptomatic, some of them were symptomatic. But if this many people go to a church, or it doesn't have to be a church, but just an example, a football game, a concert, one is sick, people in close contact, close quarters, highly infectious disease, you see what happens. Second cluster from Seongjo, which is a county near there. There's links between the church and a funeral service at the hospital. So they keep going back to these clusters. And in this thing, they show that there's a cluster of 597 cases linked to the church, 114 linked to a hospital. They have another cluster of 500 people. They don't know what they're linked to. And the problem is, if you were trying to figure out the logic of how these things are connected, right, and you work your way backwards, step by step by step, if you have too many links, you just can't chase them all. And in the math here, they have this great little picture where it looks like about 600 of the cases came from the church, 100 from the hospital, 600 are under investigation, and all of this came from 20, 30 cases that came out of either China or some other origin point. And this is such a problem. We go back to the CDC guidelines. If you look at the details of what they do, they are only testing people who complain of flu and sickness or have a respiratory infection, the CT scan, who have been to China. But we now know, just looking at South Korea, that we have an example where that only represents 5% in this instance, and it's going to get smaller all the time, of vectors from which the disease can emerge. This is the problem why you needed an incredibly aggressive containment strategy. The United States, Europe, most countries did not enact these. A couple countries did. Singapore did. And that's why they're sitting at 93 cases, and a lot of virologists think that they may have got it. Vietnam quarantined 10,000 people for 30 days on their border. Did they stop it? We don't know. But that was the level of planning that was required. We have not seen that in the West. It's a problem, and there's going to be a real consequence to it. So They're talking about cases by region, that there's a cluster in Daegu of 677, that's Southeast Korea. There's another sizable one, second largest, in Cheongbuk, which is more on the east coast of South Korea. And Seoul now is up to 45 cases. So you're going to see this spread more and more. And it's just a useful graph, and what they're doing there is they're beginning to take a lot of actions to calm things here. And this article I'm going to share with you is from the Boston Globe. It's by Hyung-Jung Kim. It's just a couple quick reports. This was, actually, it said it was updated 2 minutes ago, so maybe there's something new in here. And it's talking about Japan and Korea. Japan has now shut down all their schools for fear of spreading coronavirus. The U.S.-Korea joint military drills canceled amid the virus. So a lot of this is about that the U.S. government is trying to stop this. There's at least one case that has been reported of an infected service member. And in fact, it says here, 22 South Korean soldiers and one American service member in South Korea have tested positive for the new coronavirus, which has infected about 1,770 people in the Asian country, the largest outbreak outside mainland China. They had a major drill that they were going ahead and canceling. Further in here, it's talking about the schools in Japan shutting down, that you are talking about, do they put the number of children in here? It's got to be several million, but they don't have the number in there, so I can't tell you that. They're also saying, they're talking about North Korea, who has not publicly reported any case of the virus, but we've seen a number of things telling people how to prevent it up there, which suggests that they're at least worried about it, and that fundamentally it would be very difficult for them to have not gotten it, given the open links between them and the People's Republic of China. We actually don't know what's happening, and it is a destabilizing effect. One of the things that people need to keep in their back of their mind is that you have very tense situations between borders where countries feel at peril, and a lot of times pestilence has led to war. Let's hope it does not in this case, but it's something you need to be mindful of. So we go through all these examples to show what the spread of the disease looked like in Korea and what it might look in other places, because we haven't had this breakout here in the United States, and we've been hiding behind this sort of comfy thought that, things aren't happening here. Our public officials are saying they're not going to happen here, and yet could they happen here? And so I'm going to present a case for you of how it is happening here, and we we'll look at a potential vector for how a disease has gotten loose in California, and I'm going to make the case, and you tell me if it fits. So, as you may recall, when the Diamond Princess sent people over from Japan, which happened due to the State Department over the objections of the CDC, and without informing the president, who had reportedly been livid that it happened, which would be interesting because he didn't seem that livid last night, but more on that in a moment. I have an interesting piece from thedrive.com, and this is about logistics a little bit, but it talks about 747s carrying Americans exposed to coronavirus used new quarantine box for infected flyers. And I'll share the article so that you have the opportunity to see it, but it basically looks like a 20-foot trailer that's designed with its own integrated oxygen that loads into the back of the plane. They literally take this special plane, take the back of it off, and they load the people directly into it because they didn't want to risk breaking containment. Now, it's sort of a weird curiosity. It's so bureaucratic, too, that some levels of protecting this quarantine of the people not getting sick are brilliant. Like, they bring this box to totally protect the people. But conversely, within the plane, they use duct tape, right? And plastic wrap, basically, to separate the two portions of the plane between the sick and the healthy, even though they have a shared combined air system in the plane. So what ended up happening, we know of at least 18 people who were not sick or not presenting as sick in any case, who got sick on that plane, and that number may grow because we're still within the quarantine period, I shouldn't say the quarantine period, the incubation period, which we know runs up to 24 days or beyond. And it's an interesting example that there are all these potentials for the spread of sickness that could happen that are not being managed. So I put this out there so that you can see it's actually a pretty cool looking container, and it would have been an intelligent way to handle things. But they were brought to Travis Air Force Base. Presumably they were kept on quarantine there, and here's what we have learned. So this is from Fox 2 KTTVU News, which I presume is probably out of either Sacramento or maybe Oakland. It says all China evacuees have been released from Travis Air Force Base. and this was as of the 23rd. So all 234 of the people evacuated from China and quarantined at Travis Air Force Base have been released after remaining free of the COVID-19 virus, according to officials from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They were flown to China by the State Department and arrived at Travis Air Force Base on February 5th and February 7th. Okay, so that gives us, just working this backwards, they were there from 7 to 23. That's going to be 16 days, assuming that this was actually the day they were released. I don't know. And they say, the CDC spokesman, Scott Pauley, said they were released on 2 batches, one on Tuesday, one on Thursday, following a mandatory 14-day quarantine period. Dr. Nancy Messonnier reported those released are not at risk of spreading the virus because they are not infected, okay? So we have all that. And then they had some other people that they cared for because, let's see what they said here. Travis, however, continues to house 167 people who were flown back from Japan on Monday after possibly being exposed to the virus while on board the cruise ship Diamond Princess. Okay, so we have people from Wuhan who were there, right? We have people from the Diamond Princess who were there who are still theoretically there. And they say all 15 are being cared for or monitored at local hospitals. All right. So let's go to another thing here. This is, I want to make sure I have this right. This is from the Straits Times. Bloomberg was also reporting this. And this came out right during last night around 7 p.m. During the same time, President Trump was saying we don't have an issue. United States identifies first coronavirus case without outbreak ties. And they report this from Minneapolis. United States health authorities said they have identified the first case of coronavirus that does not have known ties to an existing outbreak, a worrying signal that the virus is circulating in the U.S. despite reassurances from the Trump administration that it is contained. The U.S. CDC said the patient does not appear to have traveled to China or have been exposed to another known case of the coronavirus. Health authorities are increasingly concerned about what's known as community spread, where the virus begins circulating freely among people outside of quarantine or known contacts of other patients. So, at this time, the patient's exposure is unknown, the CDC said in a statement. It's possible this could be an instance of community spread of COVID-19, which would be the first time this has happened in the U.S. COVID-19 is the technical name for the disease caused by the virus. The CDC said the case was picked up by doctors in California and that the patient may have been infected by a traveler who brought in the disease. It didn't give in more information on the patient's status. The new case brings the total known infections to the U.S. to 15, not counting repatriated Americans. The California Department of Public Health said the patient is a resident of Solano County, an area between San Francisco and Sacramento, and that the person was receiving medical care. The patient didn't have a close contact with a known case or travel history to China. The state said assigned the health workers are examining the patient's history to try to find out how they may have caught the virus and whether other people may be infected without knowing it. So, and the rest of it goes through the announcements and what's going out there. All right, so I will do the last story in this lot, and then we'll talk about it more. And this is from the UC Davis Community Medical Center. This was local news, and this is from davisenterprise.com. Newly diagnosed coronavirus patient being treated at UC Davis Medical Center. And this is just between Sacramento and San Francisco, right? So the UC Davis Medical Center is treating a patient who may be the first person in the country to have contracted the novel coronavirus from community exposure. So they brought it to UC Davis, and then this person said the test was positive, and they were transferred from another Northern California hospital, which we might want to presume was near Solano County or in Sacramento, somewhere around there. And they're just talking about what they're doing to take care of the people there. But here's what we know, and this is for the people who live near Davis in California and who are near there, is that the hospitals became clusters quickly. So what did I go through all these stories for? They don't know how it spread. I'll tell you how it spread. Someone somewhere along moving these people, probably with either the Wuhan group or the Diamond Princess group, mishandled quarantine. It got onto or off of the base, and it could have come one of two ways. That what ended up happening was that you either had someone there at the base who did not handle protocol properly, or that, more frighteningly, the protocol was insufficient, or that at the hospital they were treating these at, it was insufficient, and that this spread onto a surface, onto some other level, and it spread. And, you know, this is why people in the United States did not want these people there. This is why you had, huge public hearings that we reported on last week in Costa Mesa, California, and Anniston, Alabama, where they did not want people brought in here because, as we saw in Japan, as we saw in Wuhan, as we've seen in multiple countries now, where they bring these people along, people are getting sick. And what that says to me is that the quarantine measures, whether they be material in terms of not having proper protective equipment, or chronological and not having enough time, are creating an existential threat to our population in that people who are sick are being released. Solano County, where this first case was reported, is exactly the same county as where Travis Air Force Base was, and it's exactly where our CDC put these people, despite, as I read to you, the promises from the CDC director, Nancy Messonnier, that they were going to have control over this. They failed. And that is the origin of this disease, that it spreads and it jumps quarantine. It's a very ugly thing, and we need stiffer, stronger protocols. My concern is, and we've demonstrated it multiple times on this show, and I'm putting the facts out there. I invite you to look over the cases and to look over the details. I'm shortening it so we can get a whole show in. But you can see that the protocols are just wrong. It needs to be more than a 14-day period. It needs to be 24 days. And we saw on the plane they mishandled the protocol of how the material, or I should say how the air was shared in an aerosol environment. We've seen that there have been no guidances publicly given throughout the United States, including potentially to these local hospitals, to protect eyes, to protect, mouths with maybe more than an N95 mask. You might want an N99 if this is aerosolized. And I'm not saying that the doctors got sick or spread it. I don't know what the exact spreading mechanism is any more than anyone else does. But I know what happened in Wuhan, which was they had assumptions that were wrong. They did not presume optimal protectiveness because they were trying... They just didn't understand the disease, and we are making in the United States at some level the same mistakes again, whether it's a soldier walking off base with this, whether it's something going in the air supply, and we don't know exactly what it is. It could be as simple as they have a proper quarantine and this goes out in the air, gets picked up on the breeze, lands somewhere, and gets someone sick. I mean, that's terrible to say, but it could be that simple. We don't know. And then since we don't know, why are we not taking more exhaustive protections? Because we want to be politically correct about this. We want people to feel comfortable. We want to say that, we're not going to do all these things. And what we needed to do was have a much stronger, deeper quarantine for the protection of everyone involved. This is not a punishment for the sick people. This is a way to prevent more people from getting sick, because when this becomes endemic, and it will if it hasn't already, we're going to have all these problems. You see South Korea, Italy, Iran, and this is going to run. We already know this. This is where we're at right now. So, if we continue further, I'm going to share two other stories with you here real fast. That we had another story from the Boston Globe. As the CDC warns of coronavirus's spread, officials reveal more than 600 people in Massachusetts have been put under quarantine. They call it self-quarantine. We know of 300 in Michigan. There was a story I read last week. We have also, this is from New York, the New York Post. We'll put these up, just quick hits here. New York needs more surgical masks amid coronavirus outbreak. We have stories that there are 83 people who are in voluntary quarantine in Nassau County. That's Long Island, for those who don't know New York. That there are 26 people they claim to have been tested in New York. We have information that we've had from the beginning that number is far larger. I don't know what the truth is. I do know that New York is an area where you might have some problems. So let's talk about what we know from the evidence on the ground and what that might mean for where clusters might come in the United States. What we know is that the United States has brought in at least a number of people who we know are sick. Let's not even think for the moment about all the people who came from China and other points who could potentially be sick, because we can't even factor those numbers. It's too late. If they're here, we're only going to find out about it after the fact when the cases start popping up, and we're only going to find out about those if the CDC ever starts testing. You start to see why this is really hard to determine, and why this podcast has thought from the beginning that an outbreak is inevitable. But we know now a little bit about a problem, which is that the CDC and the military, whatever the quarantine protocols were, there's at least one data point of suggestive evidence in this country that corresponds with data points we saw from other countries, that somewhere in the hospital quarantine structure there is a break of the quarantine. And whether it's because they're letting people out too soon, in which case then you're going to have much wider spread, and we do have evidence of that. Now we have a case in Japan, like I shared earlier today, where a woman shown as infected 20-some days after she had the disease. Did she ever lose the disease? Did it go into remission? We don't know. We just don't know. We have no clue, and that's what's terrifying about this. That's very possible. And there's going to have to be a lot of research, but that's why it was so important to have a better containment strategy. But we know where these people were brought, and I think we can start there. That in the United States, we know that people who came over from Wuhan, who were evacuated from China, and who came from the Diamond Princess, ended up at Travis Air Force Base in San Francisco, in Solano County, between San Francisco and Sacramento. No surprise, San Francisco declared a public emergency. We know that they ended up in Miramar Air Force Base, or Navy Base, I think it is, over in San Diego, and Orange County, which is the next county over, just declared an emergency, and that's where they were actually thinking of taking the people in Costa Mesa. And we also know that there were people who were brought to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, because we saw a number of stories about that. And lastly, we know that a number of the patients who got sick were taken to the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha. So those, and I should add one more, Spokane, Washington, Sacred Heart Hospital. There were a number of people there, but those people handled Ebola slightly more confident about how they're going to handle this. But I don't want to take anything for granted, because people involved in transport, who knows? So if you were going to make a reasonable supposition about places you want to keep an eye on to determine if the quarantine efforts are succeeding or failing, and to have confidence in them, those cities would be a good place to start. The Sacramento-San Francisco corridor, San Diego area, San Antonio area, Omaha. I think that those are four areas that now are on our radar, and those of us at Coronavirus Central are watching these closely, because we do not have faith in what the CDC is reporting to you. And I think it's warranted. I hate to say it, they've said certain things, they haven't met their standards, and it's been a major problem. So at this point, I wanted to go. I've deliberately held off from this, but I watched President Trump's press conference last night, where he brought up Secretary Azar, Vice President Pence, and I don't know why Dr. Messonnier wasn't there, why they brought up someone else from the CDC. I suspect it has something to do with internal politics, but that's fine. Hopefully she's working on something more useful. They went out there, they said, basically, it's not a problem, be more worried about the flu, that they literally were counter-signaling Congress and the desire to appropriate funds for this, led by Senator Schumer. And look, just in the interest of full clarity, I write books for a living. I write them from a right-wing perspective, and because of that, I understand people look at things from a political view. I make my living off that when I'm not doing this. The problem is, this is not a political issue, and that the president is making it a political issue is absolutely disgusting, because this is a public health issue. And I have to mention that, because I was just incredibly disappointed by the response of this. And what it felt like was that they were basically trying, and this has been in the president's tweets, to just keep the market up. And they were more worried about that than the health risk of what coronavirus represents. And, when I was listening to the president talk about this, two things came up to me. Number one is, when he was standing in the back, he looked like someone shot his puppy, which means that I don't trust necessarily what he's saying. And I've watched a lot of Trump speak over the years, and I was a politician myself, because you kind of learn how to see these things. But secondly, they're going out there saying, hey, it's boring, go wash your hands, go, we've got this, don't worry about it, go spend money. And it was really upsetting that they compared this to the flu, because COVID has a fatality rate that's greater than 2%. The flu has a fatality rate that is 0.1% or lower, and a lot of those are caught up heavily in comorbidities, where it's kind of like just the domino that knocked over the avalanche. This is more infective, and the fact that it hasn't had a chance to run, and that it's just starting to, and we've seen the death toll in China, and what it represents, that there is a fundamental lack of understanding at the highest levels in this country about the threat of coronavirus, or that our government is lying to us. And whichever of those two things is actually the case, it makes it impossible to have confidence in the coordinated federal response of what's happening. And look, to be very clear, and I say this as someone who worked in government, I'm sure there are people who are incredibly competent at all levels, Department of Health and Human Services, CDC's professional researchers, but the nature of any major bureaucracy, let's say if you're sitting in an office, for instance, listening to this, whether it be government or private sector, you probably have a supervisor that got promoted to a position. They don't really know what they're doing, but they wanted to get them in a position where they can't screw things up and where they aren't in charge of anything important, right? All the jokes about middle management apply. And government is no different than that. So you end up with all these barriers to information that end up going up the line where there's probably a guy, I imagine him in my head, I call him Jim over at the CDC, who knows how terrible this is, who's tearing out the 6 hairs out of his head, and no one's listening to him because, oh, Jim, you were wrong about Ebola and SARS. This is just going to blow over. I'm going to go down to Bethesda on the weekend and go play golf. And I know this is such a banal way to talk about this, but honestly, that's the way bureaucracies work. A lot of people are looking for conspiracies, and look, we look too. If there's one, we're going to be on top of it. We got people who are paranoid in this group. But the biggest conspiracy that happens is bureaucrats covering their own backsides, and that's probably a big part of this, that mistakes get made, people cover it up because it's easier to not get in trouble. It's the same reason we're not allowed to talk about certain things. Like, is this a bioweapon? No one wants to take accountability for that. I mean, you get in bad enough trouble if you send a wrong purchase order. How are you supposed to live with those things? But this is what we deal with, and this is what I imagine is happening within the bureaucracy, that the very nature, the big level of this that is so centralized is specifically unable to deal with the fact that this is so localized. And it's a recurring problem, not just with the medical response, but with the logistical response. We talked yesterday about the need to begin getting supplies in place. We talked about the need to go ahead and get food transferred. The executive administration of this country doesn't even want money to begin preparing, because they would rather just say, well, we're going to weather it out and we have faith in the containment structures. And I'm sure there's someone in a meeting somewhere who is saying and believes, based upon procedures that they think are happening, which probably aren't in the field, that this is safe. And it isn't. And we've seen it in country after country after country. And America needs to be better than this. Every country in the world needs to be better than this. If your country's not better than this, you're going to get this. And I think, sadly, we've reached the point where that's the case. And I think there's going to be a lot of backtracking from this administration, because I watched the full press conference. It was like 40 minutes. And when you watch President Trump and the reporters asked him some very good questions, to try to probe his understanding of this case, his answers were all over the place. His answers were, yeah, it could be terrible, but it probably won't be bad, but we're ready for anything. I'm like, if you don't have a functional model of what you expect to happen, and I hope that the military or someone has one better than what we seem to see coming out of the CDC in this administration, you're not going to be able to stop it. Because if you are operating on the principle that you can stop an epidemic in your country that is endemic, highly contagious, and potentially fatal to millions of your citizens with a reactive philosophy, we're already dead. And that's why this show exists. And so one thing, the reason why we do this, and then the one thing we have hope for, and I do want to say this because we talked about assumptions. The assumption that I have made, that I will own, is that this disease that we are dealing with is functionally pretty much the same as what they dealt with in Wuhan, China, and that the lab reports honestly reported. If that is not the case, if it is less virulent or less fatal for some reason, we'll get off lighter. If it's worse, as some people think there is a mutated strain in Iran, it might be far worse for us. It might happen longer. And like I said, there's this problem we've talked about over and over again, and I just keep bringing it up because it's one of the things we don't know that we don't know, is what happens after you're cured. Do you get reinfected? Are you still infective? Are there long-term health consequences? Are you more vulnerable to other diseases? And I don't have an answer for those questions, but one of the things that we try to do with this show is we ask the questions that need answers. And I would invite medical researchers and policy leaders and journalists who probably listen to the show to get your tips. Start leaning into the people at the universities. Ask the questions. I can't tell you how to put your studies together, but I can tell you what questions are needed. And that's why this podcast is so valuable, because we have people around the world sharing insights, looking for common strands. And I'm going to bring the last point I want to bring up for today's show is we're going to do a little bit of speculation about the nature of what COVID is based upon what we have observed. And I don't know if this is right or not because we don't know exactly what this is. We know that the base of it is SARS, but this virus has very strange attributes that we've reported on that in some ways remind us of the flu in terms of that there was upper respiratory expression. Antibody-dependent enhancement is something you see in flaviviruses, like dengue fever. So there are all these little bits and pieces, and so I'm going to sort of develop that case here a little bit and offer a testable theory of what this could be that I would like to see some people really chase down so that we can begin to understand what we are dealing with as the first and necessary step towards working towards a solution of how we address the many issues that emerge from this. And we're going to start with a piece that I think is really useful. This is from the South China Morning Post, that's Hong Kong. Stephen Chen is the writer, published at 12:30 a.m. on the 27th. And it's called Coronavirus Far More Likely than SARS to Bond to Human Cells Due to HIV-like Mutation, scientists say. Now, keep in mind, when he says mutation, there's an assumption here that this was naturally developed for some reason, what the human immunodeficiency virus creates. So, a research team from Nankai University shows new virus has mutated genes similar to those found in HIV and Ebola. Finding may help scientists understand how the infection spreads and where it came from. The new coronavirus has an HIV-like mutation that means its ability to bind with human cells could be up to 1,000 times as strong as the SARS virus, according to the new research by scientists in China and Europe. The discovery could help to explain not only how the infection is spread, but also where it came from and how best to fight it. Scientists showed that SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, entered the human body by binding with a receptor protein called ACE2 on a cell membrane. And some early studies suggested that the new coronavirus, which shares about 80% of the genetic structure of SARS, might follow a similar path. But the ACE2 protein does not exist in large quantities in healthy people, and this partly helped to limit the scale of the SARS outbreak of 2002 to 2003, which infected about 8,000 people around the world. Just a quick intervention here. So it's possible also, I would say, that you could have two different ways it enters. It could enter through the SARS ACE2 pathway, which explains why we see old people getting sick and dying of pneumonia, as well as those who are immunocompromised, which was much like how SARS did it. And yet we have this other pathway that they're talking about, which is like HIV, which would hinder the leukocytes, the white blood cell elements, and the T cells, the ability of the disease to fight off. So let's continue this. Other highly contagious viruses, including HIV and Ebola, target an enzyme called furin, which works as a protein activator in the human body. Many proteins are inactive or dormant when they are produced and have to be cut at specific points to activate their various functions. When looking at the genome sequence of the new coronavirus, Professor Ronji Shu and his team at Nankai University in Tianjin found a section of mutated genes that did not exist in SARS, but was similar to those found in HIV and Ebola. This finding suggests that the 2019 NCOV may be significantly different than the SARS coronavirus in the infection pathway, the scientists said in a paper published this truth on ChinaXIV.org, a platform used by the Chinese Academy of Scientists to release scientific research papers before they have been peer-reviewed. It says this virus may use the packing mechanisms of other viruses such as HIV. According to the study, this mutation can generate a structure known as a cleavage site in the new coronavirus spike protein. The virus uses the outreaching spike protein to hook onto the host cell, but normally this protein is inactive. The cleavage structure's job is to trick the human furin protein, so it will cut and activate the spike protein and cause a direct fusion of the viral and cellular membranes. Compared to the SARS way of entry, this binding method is 100 to 1,000 times as efficient, according to the study. Just 2 weeks after its release, the paper is already the most viewed ever on China RXIV. And we haven't heard anything about this in the West, which I think is crazy, but it also speaks to the difficulty of getting information across, and that I'm grateful that we're starting to become aware of this because, like I said, we don't know what we don't know. In a follow-up study, a research team led by Professor Li Hua from the Huazhong University of Science and Technology in Wuhan, Hubei province, confirmed Yuan's findings. The mutation could not be found in SARS, MERS, or bat coronavirus that was considered the original source of the new coronavirus, with 96% similarity in genes. This could be the reason why SARS-CoV-2, which is the formal name of this virus, is more infectious than other coronaviruses, Li wrote in a paper released by China RXIV on Sunday. And for those who are out there who want to follow this, there's a lot of RXIV, like Med RXIV, China RXIV. If you're a medical researcher, right, or if you're just an interested person who wants to understand this better, read those, read the abstracts. You can find what the scientists are working on, and they're working hard and fast. And I just want to say thank you to all these medical researchers. I know you guys are putting in long hours and going down a lot of false leads. We're out there, we're rooting for you. Don't let the politicians get in your way. Meanwhile, a study by French scientist Etienne de Crowley at Marseille University, which was published in the scientific journal Antiviral Research on February 10th, also found a furin-like cleavage site that is absent in similar coronaviruses. A researcher with the Beijing Institute of Microbiology, Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, said the studies were all based on genetic sequencing. Whether the virus behaves as predicted will need other evidence, including experiments, said the researcher, who asked not to be named. The answer will tell us how the virus makes us ill. Scientists' understanding of the new coronavirus has changed dramatically over the past few months. At first, the virus was not considered a major threat, with the Chinese Centers for Disease Control and Prevention saying there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. But that assumption was soon invalidated, and as of Wednesday, there had been more than 81,000 confirmed infections around the world. Chinese researchers said that drugs targeting the furin enzyme could have the potential to hinder the virus's replication in the human body. These include a series of HIV-1 therapeutic drugs such as indinavir, tenofovir alafenamide, tenofovir disoproxil, dolutegravir, and the hepatitis C therapeutic drugs including boceprevir and tilaprovir. You notice that vir ending, that's what you use for an antiviral drug, according to Lee's study. This suggestion is in line with some reports by some Chinese doctors who self-administered HIV drugs after testing positive for the new coronavirus, but there is as yet no clinical evidence to support the theory. There is also hope that the link to the furin enzyme could shed light on the virus's evolutionary history before it made the jump to humans. Yeah, I bet you it will. The mutation, which Ruan's team described as an unexpected insertion, keep in mind insertion, I think it's really well put, could come from many possible sources, such as a coronavirus found in rats, or a species of avian flu, or, as we would submit, but these doctors will not, someone did it. So, what do we know? We know that the coronavirus we are dealing with has the ability now to infect people like HIV does. And that would make sense because we have seen from the very beginning, from the first trials of remdesivir, not remdesivir, but remdesivir is an analog drug. And now we also have, and I wrote it down because I knew I'd forget it, that there are these other drugs that we can look at that could potentially out there. So let's talk about some of the other drugs. We talked about remdesivir. Remdesivir is a treatment against Ebola. Keep that in mind, but it has shown high effectiveness. We've talked about chloroquine. Chloroquine, is a treatment that is used against malaria, but it also has had some effectiveness against flaviviruses like dengue fever, and we have seen evidence that this antibody-dependent enhancement is an element of COVID, right? And we also have seen over and over again, now we see this flu-type element that's out there in terms of how this is spreading so widely that may have been grafted on from HIV. So here is the theory that I would like to submit to you. There is something called a chimera virus, and I'll read this. This is from Wikipedia. So it's put out here. A chimera virus is defined by the Center of Veterinary Biologics as a new hybrid microorganism created by joining nucleic acid fragments from two or more different microorganisms in which at least two of the fragments contain essential genes necessary for replication. It's already referred to as an individual organism whose body contains cell populations from different organisms that developed portions of different embryos. In mythology, a chimera is a creature such as a hippogriff or a griffin formed by different parts of animals, thus the name for these viruses. Chimeric flaviviruses have been created in an attempt to make novel live attenuated vaccines. If they asked me to name this virus, I would name it chimera. And the reason I would name it that is because it seems, based on the evidence we have seen in the protein structure, now we have another piece of evidence from the South China Morning Post, whether its origin is natural or artificial, that we have a virus that has elements that are not common to its class. To the coronavirus class, we have these elements of this antibody-dependent enhancement, HIV-like spike proteins. And you'll remember, we reported last week, for those who have been following along a while, there was a paper published very early in this by a pair of Indian scientists that was basically taken down because it was suggestive that because it looked at the ACE protein that it would be seen as racially insensitive to people of East Asian heritage, but they noted from moment one that genetic sequence looked like someone grafted HIV or maybe Ebola onto this. And what have we seen? That a drug for Ebola, remdesivir, has proven helpful in attacking this. A drug that is used sometimes for things like dengue fever, flaviviruses. Chloroquine has said some ability. So there's some really good news in this, maybe, and there's some really bad news, definitely. The bad news first, that we don't know what we don't know about COVID, but we have to assume that it has some nasty little secrets in there. And that I think, although I definitely agree that the evidence exists, that the pathway being argued by the scientists in that South China Morning Post article is seeing that this spike protein is accelerating the spread, that when this becomes endemic in an area, we have seen SARS-like deaths, where we've seen people throughout China, we've seen now in Iran, I've seen one case in South Korea, where videos where people fall over like they're having internal hemorrhaging, which is much more like SARS, but we also have a much broader level of cases where people have died from the viral infected pneumonia, which would be something that perhaps could have evolved out of this protein reception area. Now, I don't know exactly how that converts to manifestation of sickness, if that's what converts to the upper respiratory infection. This is early, and we don't have all the research in it. But I would submit to you that this virus very well could go ahead and take both of those pathways, and I don't see any reason why that would be impossible. It's like arguing that if you were walking into a building, you had three choices to go up, a ladder, a staircase, or an elevator, that because you took one, you couldn't have taken others. And maybe you would take the elevator if it was really high, or you would take the stairway if in certain situations. And I think with COVID, since we're not looking at, we don't want to have assumptions, we have to consider that that's possible, that all of these things are valid. And when you start seeing a case where you see a virus that has so many different pieces that are connected to one another, that are not naturally occurring anywhere else, could it be a mutation? Maybe, but that's asking people to believe a hell of a lot, in my opinion, when you start seeing this exist where there are different things where, it's related to dengue, to Ebola now we're connecting to HIV, to SARS. There's a gain function paper we talked about for MERS. I mean, it's like someone in a lab was sitting there, took every terrible idea, put it all into one virus, and released it upon the human population, or let it escape. And did that happen in Wuhan? That's a question. We'll go back at the beginning of this to one thing that I think is really interesting. This is an article. It was published in the dailymail.co.uk, and this was on February 18th, and it's a story about, did the coronavirus originate in a Chinese government laboratory? There was a paper out about this. It was out for 3 hours before the Chinese government had it taken off a listserv. And I actually have a copy of the paper. I'll put up the link to it so you can take a look at it and judge for yourself. We talked about it in a previous episode last week. But I want to go ahead and cover the one key point that comes to what I'm talking about. The principal investigator of this paper participated in a project which generated chimeric virus using the SARS-CoV reverse genetic system and reported the potential for human emergence. A direct speculation was that SARS-CoV or its derivative might leak from the laboratory. So, and there's a number of papers, you can go hunt them down if you want, and a long history of genetic engineering happening with coronavirus cells. It goes back to the University of North Carolina in 2013 if you want to trace it all, and a lot of people are looking at that as an example of, from the perspective of saying it's some great conspiracy. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but what I'm looking at it from is as proof that the science exists, that they could go ahead and create these items, that there was, in fact, a number of papers going back as early as 2015 as this laboratory started to come online, looking at the potential of engineering coronaviruses with other attributes to accomplish certain ends. And we do know this is a bioweapon laboratory in Wuhan, and we also know that the Chinese government sent their head of bioweapons programs, who was responsible for SARS, curing SARS there, and that there were a number of papers that came out quietly years after the fact, which suggested, in fact, that SARS itself may have been bioengineered. And if you look at it that way, there's an article on globalresearch.ca that makes an interesting case. I'll post it. I'll let you look at it. It's a little more speculative than I want to go to on the show, but it's interesting, where they were talking about the number of scientists who looked at SARS after the fact and said this is a little weird, and that it's almost designed, I should put it, like a zipper that is designed to be a carrying mechanism for other diseases, and that escaped. And we know that Chinese laboratories have had historical problems, and that's why they actually didn't have level 4 laboratories for a very long time. We know with the construction of the Wuhan laboratory that the French contractor who was assigned to build this thing, because this is a global health issue to get access to these viruses, they actually ended up being pushed aside because the Chinese wanted to use their own domestic people. So, and we go back to where we started with this show, which is we don't know what the Chinese were doing. But what I would submit to you is that the COVID may be a chimerical virus where in different places and in different environments that it is set up to have different things. Think of it as a Swiss Army knife, that it's a corkscrew when the problem is a knob, and it's a knife when it needs to cut someone. Now, I hope I'm not right about that, but the good news about my theory is it should be testable. If we start seeing genetic analogs and we start seeing the functionality and outcomes that we would expect from some of these other terrible diseases, especially emerge in different climate zones and different ecologies, that the virus might be patient in an area that is low density, but it might be very infective in a place that's high density. That's that gain function we've talked about for MERS, where it knows to produce more of itself if it's spreading more rapidly. There's just so many things we don't know, and I'm presenting a worst case scenario that we may have a super virus that is going out there and targeting all of us. Here is the silver lining to this cloud. We know that remdesivir has proven somewhat helpful in treatment. We know that chloroquine has. We suspect, based upon this logic, that a lot of the big antivirals that are used for HIV may in fact prove successful as well. And I think that that is something definitely worth considering. Sorry, my apologies here. There's one that, a lot of people talk about, tenofovir. And all of these are different drugs. You can look them all up. But the bottom line is that's an anti-HIV drug. Remdesivir is anti-Ebola. Chloroquine is anti-malaria. It may be that this thing, while it is very versatile, might be able to be taken down by a lot of different medicines, and that might be the trick of it. So I don't know if that's the case. I present it as a cause for hope, and I would suggest that a reasonable course for researchers to look at, that I think they're already doing based upon this we're sharing with you, but I'm just sharing it so that you understand, will be if they start looking at this question of how we go ahead and we look at the different ways in which COVID is attacking us, and that we look at the functions that would fit other diseases, and we use the treatments that have worked for those diseases, and maybe that offers a lot of hope for a global solution where we can begin to restrain this. through a therapeutic means. And will that be enough to kill it or put out there? I don't know. We don't know what defenses it has. We don't know how resilient it is. There is at least evidence to show that this now, based on that article, is 1,000 times more effective than SARS was, which explains a lot. We don't know what secrets it has, but I think that it all goes back to this question of origin, and that we really need to put some effort into that. And, the political posturing of saying that this isn't a bioweapon so people don't panic, or if this wasn't bioengineered and released, needs to be pushed aside, and we need to let the science take the lead. So that's what I have for you today. Hopefully there's a little bit of optimism there in the end there. If we can figure out a solution or a therapeutic course of treatment where there are different drugs for different regions, or a combination thereof that can prove suppressive to this, perhaps we can begin to mount some sort of an ability to stop this. Now, I don't want to get your hopes too high. I'm making a lot of presumptions. I'm putting them all out, and I'm literally thinking aloud for you about these things. But let's hope the research leads in those directions. And in the meantime, you need to continue to prepare yourself, because even if we have those solutions and they work, we may not and probably will not have the supplies to act that quickly. And those things, even though they are helpful and they are treatments, we're still going to have a lot of people get sick and probably have a lot of people die. I'm not saying that to be mean. It's just the reality of it. And, some people like to be told, I made the joke on Twitter. It was a terrible joke, but it's true. Some people like to get up to decaf. I'm giving you a shot of whiskey every morning. But at least it's getting your eyes open, and that's okay. Some people can handle that. Share the podcast widely. Let other people know what we're talking about. I always like to give you one helpful prepper tip, and I think one useful one. We are heading towards a point where I think, based on the spread of this, we talked about it on the show last night, by March 15th, you're going to see major supply disruptions and potential area quarantines. If clusters form at the same rate in the United States that they did in other countries, and they go through hospitals, I'm thinking maybe 2 to 3 weeks from now, you're going to see it become really self-evident. That could be wrong because there's a lot of assumptions. But rather than making assumptions and having to depend on them, make the assumption things could go badly and be prepared at home. 30 days of food, go get your stuff, be ready. But I would say one other thing that is actually kind of fun, you might enjoy unless you're a very healthy person. Consider putting on an extra 10 to 15 pounds if you're very lean. And I say this because it's a common practice in the military, as well as for people who are going to be in areas of food scarcity, to have extra resources for your body to consume when your caloric consumption goes down, as well as if you think you're afraid of getting sick. Now, of course, obesity puts extra stress on your metabolic function, so you're not going to want to have a ton of extra weight. But that 10, 15 pounds that you might shed during a viral-induced pneumonia could just save your life. So eat up, drink up, have a good one. We'll close with a prayer. I hope and I pray that the medical researchers can find the truth of this. We can fight this evil plague off, and that we can find health and security for all people. We will be back tomorrow. I'm going to be talking, I think, about Iran, if I can find information, whatever big news breaks, and we'll watch this situation in California. I want to give a special thanks for this episode to some of our Twitter people. We have a person who was near Travis Air Force Base, without whom this report couldn't have been nearly as good. We also have a medical researcher in our other group from Germany who has been sharing some information about the drugs that are out there. That has been very helpful. Of course, corrections are welcome. Comments are helpful. We're going to try to continue keeping this going. I might put out a Kickstarter to expand the efforts of what we're doing if this gets much bigger, just because there's some infrastructure that would be very helpful for us in doing both the research and allowing me to continue to do this full time. So I hope you'll consider supporting that if we go ahead and do that. Of course, the podcast will remain free. Check out the book, Surviving Coronavirus on Any Budget, at Amazon. That helps keep it afloat as well. And I just want to say thank you for using us for your source of information. God bless you, keep safe, and we will be with you tomorrow.